The Black Summer bushfires in 2019 and 2020 devastated parts of Australia. In New South Wales, it was the worst bushfire season ever recorded. 26 people were killed, almost 2,500 homes were lost, 5.5 million hectares of land was burnt, and more than 1 billion animals were impacted. Government started making grants to get disaster relief out to where it was needed most. The problem was that in New South Wales, that responsibility was given to then Deputy Premier John Barilaro. So when I said disaster relief was sent to where it was needed most, what I meant was that over $100 million was dished out in a process that a recent audit report said lacked integrity. Given the scale of the bushfires, it was expected that the federal and state governments would provide some sort of disaster funding. In May 2020, the federal government announced almost $450 million for bushfire recovery grants.
So the centrepiece of what we're announcing today is nearly $450 million around local economic recovery plans. So we'll continue now to work with state governments to make sure that those local economic recovery plans are rolled out in a calm, methodical way that listens to the community and understands the community's needs.
Out of this, New South Wales got $270 million to give out through bushfire grants, which it did in stages. I want to focus specifically on the first stage of the grants program, which was called the Fast Track Stream. This funded 22 projects across New South Wales for over $100 million. I'll come back to the details of this grant, but it turns out this disaster relief was used for pork barrelling. Okay, so what is pork barrelling? The New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption, or ICAC, says it's the allocation of public funds and resources to targeted electors for partisan political purposes. Basically, it's playing around with public money to win votes. Let's say the government wants to spend public money to build some hospitals, but then instead of taking advice from the health department as to where those hospitals are most needed, it instead decides to build them in the electorates where its voter base is. That is pork barrelling, and the New South Wales Coalition government has perfected the art. Now, some have argued that pork barrelling isn't illegal. When the bushfire grants were set up, the Liberal Party Premier was Gladys Berejiklian. Here she is, defending the concept of pork barrelling.
The term pork barrelling is common parlance, and if that's the accusation made on this occasion, I'm happy to accept that commentary. I think all governments and all oppositions make commitments to the community in order to curry favour. It's not an illegal practice, unfortunately it does happen from time to time.
The Deputy Premier at the time, John Barilaro, was the one tasked with distributing the bushfire grants money. He once said, "Well, my name is John Barilaro, call me Pork Barilaro." Despite pork barrelling being morally wrong, there's also a strong argument that it is in fact a form of corruption. This is what the New South Wales ICAC Commissioner had to say about pork barrelling.
Whilst every case necessarily turns on its own factual circumstances, if a minister intervenes and overrides a government grant program or scheme, including in particular in relation to the decision-making processes by which successful applications are determined, and intentionally does so for purposes of possible electoral advantage, such intervention could constitute corrupt conduct under the provisions of the ICAC Act.
That was evidence given to an inquiry by the Public Accountability Committee. It became pretty obvious that something dodgy was going on with the bushfire grants, so the committee started to investigate. The Public Accountability Committee is a New South Wales parliamentary committee, and they were able to get access to relevant documents and have witnesses give evidence at public hearings. John Barilaro was one of those witnesses. More on that later. On the face of it, the fast-track bushfire grants shouldn't have been controversial. This was over $100 million that was allocated to projects right across the state. Documents obtained by the inquiry showed that there was only one main criteria for funding. The projects needed to be what they called shovel-ready, which meant that work could start within 6 months. The process for choosing the projects was also in that document. The Department of Regional New South Wales would identify the suitable projects and submit it to the government for funding. There was nothing in the process about John Barilaro being involved. As part of the Public Accountability Committee inquiry, the Auditor General was also invited to give evidence, and it became clear that they would be looking to do an audit into the bushfire grants. This resulted in an audit report that was only recently published on the 2nd of February 2023. The report did not hold back. It found that the $100 million program was not effectively administered by the government. The administration process lacked integrity, it did not have sufficiently detailed guidelines, and the process was not transparent or consistent. The audit was also very critical of the fact that John Barilaro effectively inserted himself into the process and made changes to the guidelines. These changes meant that councils in Labor-held electorates received zero funding. Now, Barilaro appeared at the Bushfire Grants Inquiry and gave quite a lot of evidence. Since then, the audit report has now revealed the facts, which we can compare to some of his answers. A quick disclaimer that I'm just presenting you with publicly available information, and I'm not suggesting John Barilaro is lying. And that's because if he sues for defamation, I won't be able to use anything he has said in Parliament as evidence, even though he actually said it. This stupidity is called parliamentary privilege, something Friendly Geordies knows all about. But you can make up your own mind. One more thing before we get into Barilaros' testimony. I'm mostly going to be referring to transcripts because the full video is not available. New South Wales Parliament doesn't put recordings online, other than a tiny handful on its YouTube channel. I've been able to scrape some clips from media reports, but for the most part, they just use sound bites. Alright, let's get back to it. Remember I said earlier that the process for these grants did not involve John Barilaro. This is what he said about that at the inquiry. He was asked, "Deputy Premier, you are making clear this was a recommendation from your agency, in other words the public servants at the department." He responded, "Absolutely." He was then asked to confirm that he did not make any changes to the recommendations that came across his desk, and he said, "As far as I'm concerned, no changes were ever made." That's interesting because the audit report uncovered something very different. It said, John Barilaro's office had a significant role in the creation of the package of successful projects. This is despite the fact that the guidelines don't once mention Barilaro as having any such role. So what exactly did Barilaro do? After the first step in the process was complete, the department had shortlisted 35 projects. How the department came to this shortlist is a mystery, because the audit found that the decisions had happened in undocumented meetings. This was a breach of the department's record-keeping responsibilities. These 35 projects were then sent to John Barilaro. He then reduced the projects from 35 down to 27. He excluded 9 projects and added 1 in. Not only that, but John Barilaro made up an entirely new criteria, that projects needed to be over a minimum $1 million threshold. The application of this threshold resulted in the exclusion of all projects in Labor Party held electorates. One of the areas that missed out was the Blue Mountains, an area heavily impacted by the bushfires. You might be thinking, well, he wouldn't have known what electorate these projects were in, except he was also specifically provided with the electorate details of each project, even though this should have had no relevance to the decision-making process. Let's go back to Barilaros' testimony at the inquiry, because he was asked about this $1 million threshold. In his evidence, he said, "Remember there was a minimum $1 million threshold. Remember these are joint criteria designed by the Commonwealth and the New South Wales Government." Putting aside the fact that the audit report said that that wasn't the case, let's hear what the Commonwealth had to say about this, because according to Barilaro, this criteria was also designed by them.
When was the agency informed that the threshold for that part of the stream had been raised to $1 million?
The agency was informed after the fact.
Informed, sorry?
Yeah. So the agency became aware of that afterwards. We weren't privy to the specific processes being used by the states and territories. I understand there was a parliamentary inquiry at the time when a lot of that information was provided, but generally the Commonwealth was not, as I said, it was the state and territory governments that were responsible for the specific processes used to identify the projects.
Sure.
The agency found out about that after the fact, so we weren't aware at the time of releasing or agreeing that the funds would be released to the New South Wales Government.
So the federal agencies did not know about the $1 million threshold. The audit report said this in their conclusions. at the direction of John Barilaro, a $1 million minimum threshold, not mentioned in the guidelines, was applied to projects. This resulted in a number of shortlisted projects in areas highly impacted by the bushfires, including all projects located in Labor Party held electorates, being excluded, without a rationale being documented at the time. If this isn't a disgraceful example of pork barrelling, I don't know what is. But it gets worse. At the inquiry, Barilaro had more to say, and luckily I've got a video snippet of this part.
I would have loved to have funded Blue Mountains or Snowy Monero.
Well, why didn't you?
Because the projects weren't ready under the criteria. They had to be able to be completed within 6 months or started within 6 months.
He was saying that the Blue Mountains missed out on funding because the criteria was that projects needed to be ready to commence within 6 months. Now he's right, that was the criteria of the grants. The problem is that the Blue Mountains Council was quick to point out that they had over 20 projects that were shovel ready, and yet none of them were funded. The audit report also found that this criteria was not being consistently applied. First, the department only asked for a tiny proportion of project applications to be assessed to see whether they could commence within 6 months. Then, even though they were told that 5 projects could not commence within 6 months, those projects were still funded anyway. So the one actual eligibility criteria wasn't even being followed. The audit report had even more disturbing findings. Out of the 445 potential projects, only 164 of them were assessed against the criteria. The rest weren't assessed at any point in the process. There was no documentation to explain why this had happened. The audit found that the government couldn't demonstrate that the projects that did end up getting funded would deliver the best outcome against the program objectives. That's a pretty big failure. Then there was the fact that there was no conflict of interest process for those identifying and assessing potential projects. Here's something else I found interesting. The grants were meant to be going to highly impacted areas, and so you would think an area like the Blue Mountains or the Central Coast would be high up on that list. But those Labor-held areas didn't get any funding. An area that did get funding was Goulburn, even though that region had been categorised as having suffered a low impact. They got $2 million to extend their walking track. Wait a second, that's friend of the channel and Liberal Party leftover Angus Taylor. Turns out this was his federal electorate. By the way, if you're interested in some of Angus Taylor's questionable past, I'll put a link to this video in the description. So the audit report exposed the fast-track bushfire grants as a farce, and a combination of pork barrelling and incompetence. The New South Wales Labor leader, Chris Minns, didn't hold back.
And to think that in this day and age, the New South Wales government's got to the point where the Auditor General, in an independent sense, has decided and determined that it had been politically interfered with, I think is outrageous. Now, we want to hear from the New South Wales Deputy Premier. There needs to be an explanation. If there isn't, by the end of the day, we will refer it to the ICAC. And I think that the New South Wales Premier should consider doing it as well. We cannot have a situation where an independent report is written by the Auditor General and then it just disappears from view as if it was never written in the first place. There needs to be action. We cannot have a situation where the politicisation of disasters in this state becomes the norm. We have to stamp it out right now.
Nothing happened, so Chris Minns forwarded the report to ICAC. We'll see if they look into it, although with their gutted budget, they can't even get through their current investigations. The New South Wales Liberals, as expected, played down how serious this all was. Now remember, Dominic Perrottet was the Treasurer at the time of the grants, and now, as Premier, he didn't see a big issue with it.
What I do know, as Treasurer, during that period of time, put over $4 billion in support to help our communities get back on their feet. And we know particularly down in the south areas, they were substantially affected by those bushfires, and in terms of other areas such as the flood zones that we've been in, we've always made sure that we get funding out the door as quickly as possible.
And we made changes in New South Wales when I became Premier in relation to grants allocations to ensure that the subjective nature of that would not come into play, that the funding goes to where the need is, and that's what's most important.
The New South Wales Liberals and Nationals have corruption and pork barrelling running through their veins. In New South Wales, they've been in power for well over a decade, and they think they're above any accountability. It's time we stop hearing about how they promise to be better next time. Instead, it's about time someone faced some consequences. Thank you for watching. These videos are only possible because of supporters signed up to Patreon. If you want to help support this channel grow, please consider checking out my Patreon page. Link is in the description.